Our CEO, Amanda, often uses the word ecosystem when describing the special group of changemakers represented today here in the room. Because it really is an ecosystem, it does take all of us together, working collaboratively and collectively to do the work together. And one really interesting and exciting collaboration to highlight is actually with academic institutions. So academic research has an important role in human-centered government for a lot of reasons. And for example, it can help us measure and understand inequitable outcomes, and study and test different ways to improve them. So I'm excited to be digging deeper with that with our next panelist, who's an assistant professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, the host and co-creator of TED's Your Money and Your Mind series, a Code for America board member, and the perfect expert to talk about how academic research ties into our work on the social safety net. Please welcome Wendy de la Rosa.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for joining us today. Let's start with some basics. Can you maybe help the audience dimensionalize some of the social safety net programs and maybe some of the extent of some of the participation gaps that we're talking about?
I love to, and first I just want to say thank you, Ryan, and Code for America, and all the public servants here for all the hard work that you all do every single day. Just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, when we talk about participation gap, that's the gap between the number of people who are eligible for any given program and the number of people who actually access these programs. And by and large, we see participation gaps across every single safety net program. Let's take the Earned Income Tax Credit. Every year for the last 10 years, there's 20% of people who are eligible for the Earned Income Tax Credit, around the order of $3,000 to $4,000, who just aren't receiving that benefit that they deserve, right? And the Earned Income Tax Credit is unique because this is specifically for people who have earned some income, right? Fundamentally, it's something that they've already paid their taxes into the system, and yet, because of many reasons, and we'll talk about why, right, we still see that 20%. In some states, it's up to 30%. But we see that gap even in something that's supposed to be automatic, like the stimulus check. So estimates range, but about 9 million people have still not received the first round of their stimulus check. And the question is why, right? Like, why is that? Well, you can't, for a lot of these benefits, you can't receive them if the IRS doesn't have your information. And if you earn less than $12,000 a year, or the equivalent of our federal minimum wage, or if you're in Social Security, by and large, you're not required to file taxes. And so therefore, the IRS doesn't have your information. It's sort of all of these loopholes that I think that's the beauty of Code for America that you can work to fix.
Yeah. So can you tell us how you came to do this research?
Yeah. So one of the things that we always think about is how can we make system changes? Because we know that as humans, we're beautiful, imperfect human beings, and we can't expect the superhuman out of the human, right? We are a product of our environments. And so how we design our environment fundamentally changes our behavior. And when we think about why aren't people getting the benefits that they deserve, there's a bunch of reasons. One, it's difficult to do, right? Sometimes interacting with government is hard and difficult, and filing taxes, for example, is not a simple thing to do. There's sometimes still social stigma and personal stigma. But one of the things that we know is that, especially in the US context, people have what we call an aversion to receiving assistance. So if you tell people, hey, I want to help you, they oftentimes back away. I don't need your help. And I'm sure all of you know people like that, right? And this has been played out across a number of dimensions, even in the context of physical therapy, where people fundamentally need help. They'll refuse it because it endangers and threatens our sense of autonomy. It endangers and threatens our sense of self-efficacy. And so what we thought about was, well, is there a way in which we can talk about government benefits not as something that you're being helped with, because it's fundamentally something you deserve, but as something that's already yours? And we call that concept of psychological ownership.
Yeah. So many in the audience are public servants or partners of public servants. They work on services for their constituents. So what advice would you have for them, based on your research, as they seek to reduce barriers and close these participation gaps in their service delivery or increase that psychological ownership?
Yeah. So here's what we did. We did a randomized controlled experiment in partnership with Code for America, where they built out, as you all know, this like wonderful tax filing site to simplify the process. By the way, there's some new research out there that shows that 42% of all tax filings could be automatically filed by the IRS because they're so simple, right? And so that's sort of a system change that we could do. But in the absence of that, right, Code for America built this wonderful tool. And the question is, great, that's a systems change, but how do we get individuals to actually go to the site? How do we get individuals to actually claim the earned income tax credit? And so through this randomized controlled trial, we tested different messages like, hey, we can help you file your taxes. Or we said, hey, you're eligible for $3,000 in the earned income tax credit. Both of those messages underperformed compared to a psychological ownership message that said, you have a $3,600 earned income tax credit that belongs to you. Click here to claim your tax refund. And the size of the effect is surprisingly large. And so when we look at just other types of messages, the click-through rate on those messages was around 20%. But messages that contain psychological ownership, the click-through rate there on average was 37%. Think about that change. I used to work at Google for a long time, right? Anytime you see like a 17 or 16% percentage point change, you know you're onto something. And so as practitioners, I want you all to think about what system changes can you make, right? How can you make the actual system easier for people, right? That's a system-wide nudge. But then the second question always goes back to the individual. How can you speak to individuals in a way that's not going to threaten their sense of self, their sense of autonomy, their sense of self-efficacy, their dignity, so that they actually enter the system that you want them to enter to, the system that they deserve to be a part of? Fundamentally, a lot of our systems were built to be inequitable. By their very definition, that's not something that historians will agree. Even our Social Security system, as an example, it was purposely built to exclude domestic workers because they were mostly people of color. And so we have to look at all of our systems, understand that they were built to be inequitable, and then work. And every one of us has this responsibility to work to make them a little bit more equitable. And that comes from system-wide changes, but also individual-level changes.
So Wendy, to bring it a little bit more practically as well, I thought as you were speaking, it was really interesting because this comes in the form of text messages, emails, the design of the actual physical form or website, etc. What are the different media or different forms of interventions that you're seeing here?
Yeah. So there's a couple. One of the things that I think we're massively underutilizing is this general trend that, as we all know, just smartphones in general have had a great proliferation. I mean, 93% of households have a smartphone as of 2021. It's not everybody, of course. But when you look at sort of click-through rates and engagement rates of emails, your best email will get maybe like a 20 to 15% open rate. And then of those, your best email will get maybe a 15% click-through rate. So when you work out that math, you're essentially talking about like 1 to 2 percentage points. That's not the case with text messages. And we've sort of allowed this ecosystem around government to control our attention with our smartphone. We haven't really talked about how we can use that for good in terms of people's interactions with government and sort of formalizing that process. One of the things that for me has been really eye-opening is to think about all of the application barriers that sometimes we put in place unwillingly. Like if you're applying for WIC, for example, in a lot of states, when you apply, there's a phone interview. But they don't tell you when they're going to call you. You don't schedule an appointment. And so you just have to be available at a certain date, just a certain day, and pick up a phone from a random number. Now, how many of you in the audience, raise your hand, typically pick up your phones when you receive a number from an unknown, when you receive a call from an unknown number? Raise your hand.
For those virtually, no one's raising their hand. By the way.
Okay. Not one soul, really? You're not that trustworthy? No, because we think it's spam. And yet, we believe that many low-income communities should be able to do that. And it's like, what? No. Like, that's not a best practice. That's a poor practice, right? Like, people are doing the best they can with what they have. They're trying to manage their family and work. And so for us to, again, expect the superhuman of the human is one of the things that I think every one of us in this room can change.
Yeah.
Like, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to schedule my interview appointment for so many of these government benefits. And it starts from the way in which the form is laid out all the way to how we're talking about these benefits.
Yeah. And that, it's interesting the way you put it. If I'm getting a call from an unknown number, that doesn't feel like psychological ownership at all to me, right? It's like, it's actually, I need to want to feel like I have some agency there. You've mentioned some of these rules of thumb or general best practices that practitioners should be thinking about. What else should the audience know? Anything that will help apply? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily psychological ownership, but it's treating people with dignity.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the core point of it all. How are you treating people with dignity? Whenever we create interventions, we often talk with well-intentioned people who have gut intuitions. And they believe that, I'm really going to solve the world with this new intervention or this new method. And a lot of the times our interventions are wrong for a number of reasons, right? Like the people who are building the systems don't really understand the lives and the context of people who are being served. But often because understanding human behavior is really difficult, right? We have whole academic practices devoted to understanding human behavior. And so the best practice number one is that all of us have, I think, a moral responsibility to test whatever interventions we're rolling out. Because there are a lot of interventions out there that are actively harming people. Not just ineffective, but they're harming. I'll give you sort of an example. One of the things when we partnered together to build this awesome tax filing site, the sort of thesis was people actively want help to file their taxes. And so a lot of the messages that went out were focusing on, we can help you. There's somebody there who can hold your hand every step of the way. Call us. There's going to be some. All of those messages underperformed compared to the control. And that's not because of bad intuition, right? That's just, again, we all have a moral responsibility to test our interventions. So that's best practice number one. Second, is to think about the ecosystem and ask yourself, if this was being built for a tech bro, would they call me up and complain about it, right? And if we have that mindset, all of a sudden, all of these annoying barriers will go away. Right? We have many screens, many questions, things that are just, if you thought about a different end user, you would say to yourself, this is unreasonable. But because of our biases and our historical context, for whatever reason, we expect certain communities to put up with things that are unreasonable. Right? So does it pass your tech bro test in a way in terms of, is it simple enough? And then the third sort of best practice is to think about, am I communicating with this person in a way that increases their human dignity? And that's really hard. That's really hard to do, and that's why the best practice number one of being able to test is so important. Because we all have different assumptions about what that means. And it has to be specific to the community. What works for a Latinx community may not necessarily be what works for a Chinese American community or for a community in Appalachia. it has to be localized to what dignity means to them, but that's sort of the third piece of the puzzle.
I love that. I love those 3 best practices. There's one around well, it's funny because now I'm like remembering the tech bro test, but really just making sure that interventions work, even if it's counterintuitive, testing to make sure that they work, and then making sure to treat everybody with dignity and respect. I love that. So I'm noticing that we're running low on time, so I have one final question, and then perhaps I can ask for some final thoughts. What's next for the research? What are you studying now?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things that I am personally really excited about. So as many of you know, right, our Congress passed the expanded child tax credit, which has been credited with reducing child poverty by 25%, but yet there's 2 million children who have not received their child tax credit. Again, because their families, low income, didn't require them to file taxes. We don't have universal financial accounts in this country, unlike others. And so that just creates delays in the system. As you think about another emergency shock, right? We have such a huge portion of our population that's unbanked or underbanked, and so they're still waiting for paper checks. The other piece of this is I get really excited as to how we can help the IRS, what I think about as sort of the backbone of our country, become more efficient. As we're asking them to do more with less. And so if any of you are interested in collaborating in academic research and really testing what works and doesn't, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Wendy. It's really been, well, just an honor and a joy to have you with us today. Do you have any final remarks, anything else for our audience today?
Well, I think the last thing I'll say is, again, every single person in this room has a moral responsibility to ask yourself, have I tested my assumptions? Because even with the best intentions, again, it's not that we're creating something that's ineffective. A lot of interventions that I test and I see are ineffective. So for example, we may think about financial education programs, right? There's sort of this assumption oftentimes that if I get people in a room and I teach them how to save, especially if they're in high school, down the line, they're gonna be able to save more. And all of the research shows across 200 studies is that it's largely ineffective, right? Because what matters is the system that young adult finds themselves in. It's not really about that 1-hour class that they took. And that's actively hurting people, because then we're wasting tax dollars. And so I hope that you come across from the session thinking about, how can I test my interventions? How can I test my assumptions? And does it pass that tech bro test?
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Wendy. We really appreciate you being here with us.